that because I'm prepared to accept that some causes and effects may be occurring at the same time. Again, they are in time though, but as I said, I'm prepared to say there are other sorts of explanations which are not causes, which perhaps are some other type of reasoning explanations, such as a logical connection. That's fine, yes, but again, I do not see how that's going to help explain the universe by saying that the universe is logically grounded in some necessary being called Allah. Why not just say then that the universe is the necessary being?
I really think UC should have afforded a couple.
I wanted to ask, if the belief in Allah is rational, then every aspect of the Quran must be rational. Then where does the whole creation story or kind of explanation of Adam and Eve fall into that? Like, does evolution offer a more rational basis of creation rather than the story of Adam and Eve? And so what's Islam's stance of Adam and Eve in regards to the fossils and dinosaurs and all the kind of evidence for evolution? Like nowadays scientists claim evolution is a fact and they say it's no longer a theory. So what's Islam's stance on this?
Sure, thank you. That's a very good question. And I actually wanted to mention this in my presentation. Now, just because some Muslims can come to the conclusion that an existence of God with good reasons to believe that a cause exists and it has the attributes of the monotheistic version of God that is also mentioned in the Quran. And the Quran is a signpost to the transcendent. It's a miracle based on linguistic, historical and scientific statements that it makes, because we can't argue from a naturalistic perspective that they actually came from nature at that time, so we have to seek supernaturalistic explanations. We don't always have to, we come to that rationally. However, it doesn't make us rationalists. And I give you an example. Our ration has taken us to the point where the Quran is beyond our ration, because we can attribute to this transcendental cause. Do you see? And it's something called role of the mind here. The mind has taken us somewhere, and now we understand that there's something beyond our ration. And the way to explain it is, imagine Peter Cave was a philosopher. Oh, he's a philosopher. Doesn't sound like one though. Hey, I'm kidding. It's a joke, it's a joke, it's a joke.
I don't mind the abuse.
It's fine. Well, you mentioned fornication so many times. I'd rather mention something a bit more easier to the ear, maybe to the soul. And my point is, imagine here's a mathematician and he's going to teach us calculus, right? I know that he's great at calculus. And if he starts writing set theory on the wall in calculus, and then I say to him, that's wrong. How dare you write that? Don't I sound very stupid? I came here to learn calculus of him. I know nothing about calculus, but he was teaching me. That's the same way, the way Muslims view it. Our minds, as the Quran says, do not use your mind. Take us to the existence of God. Take us to the journey that the Quran is actually transcendental. It's from the transcendental cause, it's a miracle. And then from there we understand, okay, now let's learn from this. Let's try to understand this. Yeah? Let's try to connect with this. Similarly, we know Peter Kay, for example, is great at calculus. We know nothing about calculus, but our minds, our ration has taken us to the point where he is great at calculus because we know he's got a degree in calculus, he's taught it for 50 years, etc., etc. So our ration has come to the point that he's great at calculus. And then he starts writing calculus on the wall, on the whiteboard, and then we disagree with it. That's irrational. So the point is, it's rational to claim that if it's taken us to a source that's greater than our ration, it's rational to claim that we shouldn't actually even try to rationalize what it actually says. And that's what Islam is about: submission. It's about submission, about really removing your ego, removing your nafs, as we call it in Islam, to not refer to our kind of limited nature, but to refer to the cause of the whole universe, this ultimate being. And that's the profound thing about Islam, is really that's the exercise of a Muslim, is to really remove our egos, to really refer and connect with God. And that's the whole point. Now, with regards to evolution, the way we could deal with it is, look, if you have a naturalistic paradigm, if you believe scientific naturalism or empiricism or science, whatever you want to call it in philosophy, is the only way to form conclusions, then I would agree evolution is a great explanation. It's a great explanation, if that is your only method that you're using to form conclusions about life in the universe. But you're presuming that scientific naturalism is the only way to form conclusions on this point. And I disagree with you, because science or scientific naturalism cannot even prove logical truths like mathematics. You actually require mathematics and logical truths before you even have science. And if science was trying to prove maths and logic, it would be trying to argue in a circle. Science can't even prove morality or even love. Imagine telling your wife, I love you, and she's a scientist who says, prove it. okay, shut up, here's some chocolate. Yeah? You know, what can you do? You know, science can't even prove political truths. Yeah? So the point is, it is an assumption here, and it's a dangerous assumption in the 21st century, which I call the Richard Dawkins assumption, because he's like a logical positivist, which means everything you say you must verify in the physical world. Well, that leads you to huge problems. Yeah? Even when you start saying things like bad and good and fellow feeling, you can't even justify from that perspective. Yeah? And that's a dangerous route to take because it's philosophically false. And the very fact that you think that scientific naturalism is the only way to form conclusions can't even be proven by scientific naturalism. It's self-defeating. So if you just use that paradigm, then yeah, it's a good explanation. But even within that explanation, it's never called a fact, by the way. It's called a fact in the theory. There are certain facts with regards to genetics, there are certain facts with regards to mathematics and DNA, etc. And the theory is the thing that weaves through these facts. Yeah? However, as a Muslim, I would argue, look, our philosophy is slightly a bit more broad, because we don't just take the empirical sciences, we take political thought, and rational thought, and theology, and we have a whole plethora of different methodologies to apply to different realities. And I would argue, look, you have a speculative methodology called science, and it is speculative. If you read the philosophy of science, you know science can't even prove the external world exists. I don't know that actually is happening. I don't know my brain is not in Mars and there's an alien with probes in it and making me think, and I'm speaking at the moment. You can't prove that. It's called a philosophically basic assumption. Yeah? So the point I'm trying to make is that it's a speculative methodology. I would argue that our knowledge, regards from the Quran itself, we could show good reasons come from the divine. So what we have is a methodology that's speculative from its basis, and you have a methodology that's divine. And we've got justifications for that. So what would you take? David Hume, he mentioned David Hume, and he said, and it's oft repeated what he says, the wise man, he makes his conclusions on the proportion of evidence. So you have a speculative methodology with a conclusion, and you have something that's less speculative, if you want to even use those terms. So where does it balance out? So I will stick to here for now. It's interesting, this is interesting, but I will stick to this because philosophically I've got greater reasons to believe in that. Also, with regards to Adam and Eve, maybe in Peter's paradigm would be Adam and Steve. Why not? You said it's fine, you should live and let live, didn't you? Well, there you go, it's fine then. It's
But I'm just wondering why you're calling a woman Steve, but if you want to...
Okay, that's fine. So, with regards to Adam and Eve, I don't understand your question. What do you want to say with regards to Adam and Eve?
What I meant to ask was basically, with Adam and Eve, like, is the explanation of evolution more rational than the explanation of how man came through Adam and Eve? Like, because many people have curiosities, like me myself, of how mankind came to creation.
Sure.
And if I think that I look at what the Quran proposes, Adam and Eve, like the whole mankind comes from two people.
Yep.
And then look at evolution through the whole process of.
Sure.
Yeah, so that you find it more kind of, in comparison. You understand what I'm saying? In comparison, Adam and Eve seem less rational as compared to.
No, that's not true. It's actually what you're saying, and to define rationalism properly, that's why I spent a lot of time defining it. Evolution is not rational. It's actually empirical. It's empiricism. Rationalism and empiricism are the big, profound debate in philosophy. Rationalism versus empiricism. You actually use an empirical method, which sense experience is dependent on, knowledge is dependent on sensory experience. And that's how you conclude that evolution is true. Do you see? So you're not being rational at all. You're probably being irrational. But not in the sense that, in the popular sense, but in the philosophical sense, you're being empirical. What you're trying to do is you're conflating two different philosophies. They're two different non-complementary paradigms. You've got one philosophy, which is the Quran, which we've come to the conclusion by other evidence, rational evidence, that is divine. And we've got another non-complementary paradigm or philosophy that comes to its own conclusion by another route. And you're trying to mix them together. They're two different answers from two different base philosophies. The reason I would take the Quran over the other is because I think there's more good reasons to believe in the Quran rather than the speculative methodology of science. It doesn't mean we don't use science, by the way. But it's not the only method to come to form conclusions about life and origin of species, etc. But it is interesting. That's why many Muslims study it. They don't have to agree with it. For example, you even have Dr. Michael Behe. He wrote a very interesting book called The Edge of Evolution. It's a very interesting book. And from my minimal reading, if we were to stick just in the scientific paradigm, there's actually good arguments against macroevolution, i.e. species evolve within species and from one species to another. There's actually good evidence to and against. And if you read Michael Behe's book, The Edge of Evolution, there's some good evidence. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know. So the way I deal with it is more of a philosophical perspective. It's like, what is the basis for this methodology to come to this conclusion? And what is the basis for that methodology to come to a conclusion? The question presumes that the way to form that conclusion is only by sensory data. And that's why I said rationalism is not about that. Rationalism is about sensory data, but innate concepts and ideas that we apply to reality. And I gave the Socratic example in Immanuel Kant, that we actually do bring innate concepts to our experience to understand experience. Do you see? It's a long topic. It requires lectures on rationalism and empiricism, but maybe that's created more questions than answers, but that's a good thing, probably. Oh, sorry, you want to answer this as well?
Well, I thought I'd just say a few words after the very, very pithy comment by Hamza to the question. I'm still not totally clear, but I suspect Hamza is then saying that he prefers believing what is said in an old book with lots of inconsistencies and iffy reasoning, rather than a huge amount of evidence to do with evolution. That doesn't mean that, therefore, every particular feature claimed in the evolutionary theory is sort of sacrosanct and will never be changed. It does mean that there is a huge amount of evidence in favour of evolutionary theory, and I gather from scientists and biologists and so on that the evidence is as overwhelming as the evidence that the Earth goes around the Sun, which I gather is also something which is controversially put forward and rejected in the Quran. I'll make one or two other points, namely, Hamza correctly implies in the 17th and 18th century there were discussions about rationalism versus empiricism. But very few philosophers today will put it all down to rationalism or all down to empiricism. When we're talking about whether it's rational, we are talking about using our reasoning and looking at the evidence. If you use your reasoning and look at the evidence and look at various studies to do with the distribution of diseases and look at how various selections work, be it artificial selection or domestic breeding as well as natural selection, then there's a huge amount of evidence in favour of evolution. And it isn't a theory in the sense of, oh, it's one theory amongst many, it is the main way of understanding life. That does not mean that I'm committed at all to saying that therefore there's an evolutionary explanation for how those ingredients came about. I don't think there is one, but that's a separate question, and I certainly would not base my understanding, though, of life forces in terms of what has been written in an old book written many years ago, and it is not unassailable. It is not agreed amongst all Islamic scholars and amongst other scholars that therefore this is some specially written pure Arabic book from Allah. There are disputes about it, and so in that position you should say it's so incredibly unlikely that this is some sort of miracle text, especially given some of the nasty things in it. So it would be better to go on the evidence around us.
Hi, I have two questions. I'll start first with, since I only have one question, I'll direct it to Hamza. This question is about animals. Do you believe it's rational or egotistical to believe that, regarding purpose in life, there wasn't a God, there wouldn't be purpose, original purpose, objective purpose? Ultimate purpose. Is it rational or egotistical to believe that humans have the greatest purpose in life? They're given a test, they're going to heaven, whereas other creations, for example, animals, creatures, are there to serve us as purpose, to feed us. Is it rational to believe that humans have the great purpose in life, or is it egotistical?
Sure,
Thank you.
good. Well, I actually believe animals have a purpose too. So I think it's rational both, that animals to have a purpose and humans to have a purpose. I mean, there's an interesting moth in a particular forest, and this is the courtesy of David Attenborough, BBC. And upon this moth actually drinks the sap of this tree. It's drinking away. And underneath this moth, there's a second moth. Because the first moth, while it's drinking the sap, instantaneously has a poo. It goes to the toilet, excrement, it